Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my top 10 worst superhero romances. So, it's Valentine's Day, and I thought we'd have some fun with this one. 2 years ago, I covered my favorite superhero relationships, but now it's time to go through the absolute worst, and oh boy, is this a real and true race to the bottom. I mean, I knew comic book relationships could get bad or lousy or just plain awful. But after I started doing some research into this, I realized I truly had no idea how bad things could really get. When I think of lousy comic book relationships, well, I'm just gonna say most of the ones you guys are probably thinking of right now are kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the horrors we are about to witness. We are about to dive into a sea of madness and depravity, the likes of which we've never really covered on this channel. It's gonna be fun, painful, terrifying, and sometimes a mix of all three. Consider this a warning then. This is not a video for the faint of heart. So buckle up, get ready to shudder, and prepare yourself for the all-time worst relationships in the history of Marvel and DC. Enjoy. Number 10. Black Panther and Storm. First up on the list is a pretty straightforward one, since most people I know would agree this was a rather pointless relationship. Two factors really cement this one's placement here. First, this really doesn't have any sort of meaningful setup. These were two characters that, though they did have some things in common and the occasional interaction before, they really never had much history together, and all of a sudden they were just getting married. I'm honestly racking my brain trying to figure out why they were paired off together, and the only reason I can come up with is that they are both black and from Africa. That's a pretty big accusation to throw in Marvel's direction, yet I have trouble coming up with an alternative explanation, and I know I'm not the first person to speculate that this was the case. But regardless of that, there's another reason this is here. This relationship was ended just as suddenly and abruptly as it had began during Avengers vs. X-Men. Black Panther just sort of marched right up to Storm and was like, yeah, our marriage is over. Like it was nothing, because, well, it kind of was nothing. They had had a few moments together during their marriage, but it really felt like the whole thing was completely pointless. As far as poorly handled relationships go, this one easily takes the cake, with both their wedding and divorce basically being a wasted sideshow for Civil War I and Avengers vs. X-Men respectively, with a couple of stories thrown in between these events pretty much just only ever focusing on one of the two characters anyways. Since then, the relationship has basically been forgotten, except for a few tense moments later on between the two, with T'Challa just begging her not to hook up with Wolverine, and Storm promptly going ahead and doing exactly that. Hooray! Number 9. Donna Troy and Terry Long. So this is kind of a weird one, mostly because it takes place right near the end of actually one of my favorite Teen Titan runs ever, the Wolfman Perez era. It had only been a few stories ago that they had created the Judas Contract, what has come to be viewed as one of the best Teen Titan stories out there and just one of the better superhero stories in general. Wolfman and Perez were flying high and had the attention of the comic book community. Everything was going pretty great, and then Terry Long showed up. Here is a character whose origins and purpose have been a matter of debate among the fans, but looking back on it, I think this is basically writer Marv Wolfman in comic form. This is a bad example of his own wish fulfillment, a man without powers, heading towards his middle age, suddenly thrust into the center of this world that he loves, where there's not only these cool superheroes that come to accept him, but they like him to the extent that he gets to date one of the hot chicks, and eventually marry her. That's creepy, and it shows in the work. Terry is introduced as a professor seeking tenure at a college that Donna Troy is attending, which is questionable to begin with, and the two hit things off from there. They get married, and everything pretty much fell apart immediately after that. George Perez left Teen Titans, and the series never quite recovered. Within the story, Terry and Donna had a son, and he would have been destined to turn into a great evil one day, and that was a whole thing. The marriage was eventually broken apart, and Terry Long was later killed off-panel. The whole situation now has basically been forgotten in continuity as best as the writers and editors could manage, but the damage was already done. Teen Titans, which had had such a great run going for them at the time, and was really presenting the team in a fun and interesting way, was basically thrown into disarray, and perhaps worst of all, Donna Troy, an already confusing and complicated character, was made that much more harder to understand and follow, or even just like as a person. It's hard to relate to somebody whose actions don't make a lot of sense. And this was one in a long line of decisions that made Donna Troy famous for being the character with one of the most convoluted and insane backstories ever. The rest of the Teen Titans didn't fare much better, blindly and almost suspiciously accepting Terry Long and Donna's decision to be with him. No villain showed up to throw a wrench into the mix, nor any hints of something darker going on. Donna just apparently decided to marry a professor 10 years older than her without any meaningful connection to the Teen Titans. And that's a little weird, especially for her character. The only reason this isn't higher on the list is that I think somewhere, on some level, there was some purpose to all of this. I think Wolfman was trying to give this series a sense of unpredictability. Instead of going the obvious route and having Donna pair off with Robin or something, he wanted to throw a curveball at readers, and in a series famous for being dark and edgy, he went for something light and without a secret agenda behind it to throw fans off. I think that was the idea, but what happened, as I've said, was closer to somewhat of a perverted, weird wish fulfillment fantasy where Wolfman put himself into his own story. A terrible mistake, and a trap that can happen to writers. Terry Long is perhaps the biggest example of a self-insert character ever created. One that maybe had a daughter and ex-wife, cementing the whole creepy vibe with Donna, but otherwise just a nice, normal dude with no discernible traits or qualities that might suggest why Donna would be interested in him. Yet because it was Wolfman's stand-in, he got to marry the character and never really showcased any humanizing flaws. He was a pretty terrible character. Few other relationships in comics have achieved this level of awkwardness and poor writing, and it's a reminder that even good writers can fall for bad writing traps. Wolfman is still one of the best Teen Titan writers to have ever worked on the series, but this was not one of his better moments. Number 8. Havoc and Nurse Amy. I almost missed this one, but this last-minute addition to the top 10 really feels like it deserves a spot here. This one hails from Chuck Austen's X-Men, and oh god, do I really have to get into it any further than that? This is the guy who took the X-Men and all their greatness and turned them into a bunch of gibbering lunatics, which was only recovered after he left. In this relationship, Havoc fell into a coma and became enamored with a nurse, while in a coma, through a psychic connection. Why? How? You're already putting too much thought into this thing, because no one else did. After Havoc woke up, he did the only sensible thing, abandoning his fiancée Polaris at the altar, because, he fell in love with her in a boring non-coma state, and running off with Annie and her son. This new and completely out-of-left-field relationship never went anywhere and fell apart off-panel. It was terrible and dumb as hell, but not surprising from Austen, who was just never a good fit for the X-Men. This pairing suffers from everything awful of this era of comic books and every mistake Chuck kept making during this time. Bad and silly writing, taking mature content and approaching it in a completely childish manner. The story itself is basically a train wreck so bad I almost wanted to throw Polaris into this mix too, since her behavior is also pretty terrible. But it's really Annie who was the source of all the trouble and silly conflict and pages upon pages of useless, preachy dialogue that makes me just want to... I hate Chuck Austen's X-Men. Annie was basically banned by every writer since Chuck Austen from showing up in the comics ever again, and as far as I'm concerned, good. The more we can forget about this era of X-Men and purge it out of the continuity, the better. Number 7. Bruce Wayne and Barbara Gordon. Well, we're really starting to venture into awkward territory here, aren't we? This is a relationship that on the very surface most people can tell you why it is plain wrong. It would be one thing if this was just a matter of age difference. There's nothing really wrong with a May-December romance, and we shouldn't look down on such things just because it's icky. However, Bruce and Barbara present a host of other problems, the biggest being that Barbara is Jim Gordon's daughter. Sleeping with one of your closest allies and friend's daughter is generally frowned upon, and for a good reason. It's just plain skeezy. And, when you get right down to it, wildly out of character for both Batman and Batgirl. But even taking all of that aside, which there's no reason to do so, but even if we did, Batman is still very much a mentor to Batgirl, and thus sleeping with her feels very much like an abuse of power that goes way too far for Bruce's character. It reminds me of the Terry Long situation, and that's not cool. Perhaps what is most mind-boggling is that this has actually happened twice. One incident has become rather infamous and is the one you're probably thinking of, being a big part of the animated adaptation of The Killing Joke, and probably a big reason why that movie kind of sucks. But what you might not know is this ugly business had already appeared once in the pages of Batman Beyond 2.0. There, not only did Bruce and Barbara sleep together, probably on more than one occasion based on the comic, but they did it at a time when she was with Dick Grayson. Even worse, Bruce actually impregnated Barbara during this affair, and the whole thing led to a messy fight between Dick and Bruce they never really resolved and recovered from. And in all of it, Bruce never even seemed to show a lot of contrition for this awful, awful behavior. It's all pretty terrible when you get right down to it. In both portrayals, it just makes no sense. Batman might be broody, sure, but he's not a sociopath, nor would he have any reason to do this. Bruce actually does have personal failings, but they aren't along these lines. And Barbara isn't really all that broody to begin with, so this seems entirely out of her wheelhouse. Her in particular, it just feels utterly incompatible with this character. It's one of the worst and most ugly relationships in comics, an insult to fans, and completely counter to the story and established canon of Batman. And the only part that amazes me is that somehow, this is only number 7 on the list. But just you wait. Just you wait and see how things get. Number 6. Ultimate Scarlet Witch and Ultimate Quicksilver. Ugh, gross. You know, I did enjoy the Ultimate comics to a degree. They did some cool things and had some cool moments. But one thing that never worked, and I've never really heard anyone defend, was the questionable decision to pair off Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, heavily implying the two were in an incest-based relationship together. That's just gross. That's gross. There's no way around it. And even then, if you somehow overlook the incest thing, and I do not do that willingly, but I've actually heard people say, well, what is wrong aside from them being brother and sister? Which is an insane question, but even if you ask that, they're actually a terrible couple. They treat each other horribly. Scarlet Witch openly flirts with other people. It's just so dumb. The only reason this doesn't top the list is that I feel the part of this writing suggests it is supposed to be a weird relationship to the reader. Maybe that's true, but if so, the comic is very inconsistent about this point. Within the story, the only person that has a problem with these siblings having sex with each other is Captain America, yet the rest of the team just sort of brushes the whole thing off. Wasp basically tells Cap he's being an old fogey for not embracing this brother-sister power couple. As if we in modern times would be totally okay with this, and the only reason to question this relationship were if you were airlifted from 1940s. This was all done at the hands of Mark Millar, of course, and suggests, along with a mountain of other evidence, that this guy has some very weird and outright incorrect views about human sexuality. Honestly, the less we dwell on this one, the better. It's wrong. Incest is wrong. That's not how you make a race of mutants, at least not the kind you're looking for. Number 5. Supergirl and Comet the Wonder Horse. Okay, here we go. So in Action Comics number 311, Supergirl's pet superhorse Comet, yes, that was a thing. Just go along with it. Comet got jealous of Kara being with a human, controversially, so it had Cersei turn it into a human. Comet and Supergirl very nearly hooked up, with them kissing and nearly falling in love or something before the whole thing was undone. And though one could argue that Comet is sentient and at least turned into a human, it still really feels like Supergirl nearly banged a horse. The whole thing reads like a 13-year-old girl's misguided fantasy written in her journal, but it wasn't. This was a story written by a grown-ass man who apparently didn't know any better. And even by Golden Age comic standards, this was weird, creepy, and one of those things best forgotten. You could argue this story was written for children, but this is not the sort of content that should be shown to children or anyone. The whole notion, and Comet himself, would eventually go to the wayside, and thankfully the plotline was dropped about as quickly and arbitrarily as it had appeared. Comet would later go on to be reimagined in the 90s as a jockey revived as a cybernetic horse of some kind that fused with a bisexual comedian and became an angel of love. And what the hell am I saying? Is this true? Okay, it's time to move on. Number 4. Sue and Ralph Dabney, and Jean Loring and Ray Palmer. So here we have two relationships that actually started out fine. Ralph Dabney was a superhero called the Elongated Man, and with his wife Sue, they worked together to solve crimes. No big deal, and in fact, they were one of the first superheroes to ever marry in comic book history, so that's really cool. They became fan favorites of sorts, and Ralph even won an award as a character in 1961. Meanwhile, Ray Palmer, the Atom, and Jean Loring had dated for a while in the Silver Age before marrying and ultimately divorcing. Jean was just a normal lawyer. She was occasionally involved in court cases, but after they broke up, they really didn't do much with her. I actually do like the whole idea of them divorcing, as it was one of the few examples of a couple splitting up in comics without resorting to death or contrived nonsense. This was all perfectly fine, and though these four were never the most popular characters, only appearing sporadically and never being a huge part of DC canon, it was all good. That all changed in 2004 with the miniseries Identity Crisis. Now, if you aren't familiar with this event, well, I don't care for it. I find it really poorly written, and to me it represents a failed attempt by DC to tackle mature themes and just totally and utterly missing the mark. Some people like it, but I am not one of them. The story behind Sue in Identity Crisis reveals she was raped by Dr. Light, and the DC heroes all agreed to just sort of wipe the whole thing from the villain's memory and pseudo-lobotomizing him into the buffoon that he was in the comics up until this story. And the whole thing was actually a red herring because the real killer was Jean Loring, ex-wife to the Atom, and one that killed Sue because she went crazy for some reason and wanted to get back with Ray? I think? That is unclear to me, but regardless, it's weird and it makes no sense. She was basically just a regular lawyer that somehow threw the entire Justice League into disarray. Look, I understand some people like this story and that's fine, but I hate it. I hate this story and what it stands for to the core. I feel this used two relationships and the very concept of rape to push a mediocre story, and I find it very frustrating. There are a lot of good comics out there that deal with rape or even use it as a plot device that at least do it in a mature and thoughtful way. Identity Crisis is not one of them, and handles the whole issue with the tact and grace of a bulldozer. What's worse is that it not only made Sue and Ralph and Ray and Jean look bad, it bled into the entire superhero community. They lobotomized a person while wiped the mind of another. It tangled up these characters in a bad way, but it also made the Justice League seem really far beyond moral ambiguity. To me, the villains of Identity Crisis are not Jean Loring or Dr. Light, but characters like Green Lantern, the Atom, or Green Arrow, who let this sort of thing happen under their direct and willful decision-making. To me, this is a special level of poison. Sue Dibney suddenly felt like another woman in a refrigerator, while Jean Loring, for no good reason, became an insane murderer, eventually possessed by Eclipso before being killed off panel. Oh, and Ralph died at some point after all of this too, but at least it gave him something interesting to do during a good story known as 52. Regardless, these characters and their relationships were torn down, and the characters were so badly damaged, all in a misguided effort to be more like Marvel, who at the time were producing content like Civil War. But Identity Crisis was nothing near that. It went so overboard with trying to be mature and smart that they made their entire superhero community come off as utterly monstrous, and these relationships, these four characters here, never could fully recover from the burden of this story. Sue, Ralph, and Jean would return in Blackest Night as zombies here to ruin Adam's day and torment a bunch of other people, which really didn't help matters, but the damage was already long done. The whole thing has left a bad taste in many a fan's mouth, and it's hard not to look at these characters without thinking of them. And to me, that's taint on a level it's just hard to overlook. To me, these four represent some of the worst and most degraded relationships in the world of superhero comics. But I can top that. Number 3. The Parker Family in Trouble. Uh-oh, here comes trouble. No, seriously, this is one of the worst comics I've ever read. We are really in the thick of things now, and if you haven't heard of this miniseries, well, I'm just gonna warn you, some things can't be unseen, guys. So, Trouble is a series that goes into what Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and Peter Parker's parents, Mary and Richard, got up to when they were young. And it turns out that Aunt May slept with Peter's dad, got pregnant, and to avoid the ire of her fundamentalist parents, arranged things so that Mary Parker would raise the kid with Richard, and they'd start a family together. They told nobody, and the two adopted the baby, Peter, as their own. Yes, that's right. According to this comic, Aunt May is actually Peter's mom. And Peter's dad cheated on Mary with May. And while it'd be one thing to do this, I mean, it flies in the fundamental aspects of Spider-Man's history, but if Marvel wanted to do this, fine. But this miniseries also happens to be complete and utter garbage. While the art is actually fantastic, this comic feels like an outright attempt to make you, like Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and Peter's parents, less, using Spider-Man callbacks and references in these weird, gross ways. I mean, honestly, it feels like reading a comic about your mom having sex with a bunch of guys when she was younger. It's not a pleasant read. The writing is just awful, with poorly written characters, a story that feels out of place with the time period it's supposed to take place in, and the themes of Spider-Man in general. And once again, we have a plot dealing with mature ideas like abortion, suicide, and sex, with a level of sophistication I would expect out of a child. That child's name is Mark Millar, by the way, the only writer who actually has 2 entries on this list. It's not surprising this guy would have recurring problems with sexuality in his writing that represent some of the worst in comics. I mean, have you read Nemesis? It's just a little disappointing though, as there are plenty of comics written by him that I actually do like. Yet we can't ignore that he has had real stinkers in his bibliography, and Trouble is a solid example of some of his worst. This was apparently an attempt to get girls interested in Marvel Comics. Ha 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 ha. That is a joke given the final product and the fact that as much as I like Mark Millar's stories, he is perhaps the last contemporary, established comic book writer on the planet I would pick to reach out to a female audience. Trouble isn't for girls, and it definitely isn't for Spider-Man fans. I don't really think it's for people. The Parker family presented in this story are cruel, mean, and selfish to each other. The whole comic just comes off with a really bad taste to it. They couldn't be farther from the versions we know and love, and represent 2 of the worst relationships to ever show themselves in anything resembling a Spider-Man comic. Sadly, there's one very notable exception, and that is... Number 2. Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy. So yeah, I'm guessing most comic book fans in the know probably expected this one to show up somewhere, and they are correct. A few of you probably are wondering if this really happened. Sadly, it very much did. In 2004, Marvel published a story called Sins Past, where it was revealed that Norman Osborn impregnated Gwen Stacy with twins, who she secretly gave birth to in France before her death in New York. Alrighty, this is pretty much enough to earn a spot on this list right here. Originally, Spider-Man's writer at the time, J. Michael Straczynski, wanted to have the twins be Peter's kid before the Marvel editors decided to shut that idea down. So I put most of the blame on the higher level publishing staff. Straczynski later at least wanted to correct the terrible mistake that is this story during One More Day, but again, Marvel's editors turned that down. It was all part of the ongoing crime scene that is Marvel's editorial board during this era of Spider-Man, and boy, does this story just kind of bum me out. As anyone with half a brain can tell you, this story does a real disservice to Gwen Stacy's character. It's so obvious of a betrayal to her and how she existed in the comics, and counter to the idea behind her and her death, that most fans, and even Marvel itself, generally prefer to pretend this never happened. I mean, why would she even want to sleep with someone like Norman Osborn? It just makes no sense. Sins Past, and by association this relationship, remain infamous for being just one of the most sleaziest, backhanded, and lousiest moments in Spider-Man history. Why Marvel can't just leave the night Gwen Stacy died alone is beyond me. One could argue they were running out of ideas, but that's a cynical view that assumes there's a lot of directions and stuff you can still do with Spider-Man. He's literally like almost a limitless character in terms of that. So when I hear that argument, all I say is that suggests a lack of creativity on the part of the creative team. Ugh. It was an ugly story, and one thing I think people actually overlook is that as bad as this was a treatment of for Gwen's character, it didn't exactly make Norman Osborn look much better either. Look, I could be wrong, but I always kind of liked Gwen's death because it felt so random and incidental. Norman Osborn recovered from amnesia, became the Green Goblin again, and knowing Spider-Man is Peter Parker, kidnapped Gwen and threw her off a bridge. It was brutal and an important moment in Spider-Man's history, and the second real death that truly affected him in his story. What works for it, in my view, is that Norman didn't really have anything particular against Gwen. He just used her as a tool to get at Spider-Man. That makes more sense to me that the two didn't have this weird, complicated relationship prior to this. And while the damage to Gwen's character was worse, when it comes right down to it, no character benefited from this story and relationship. To me, pairing these two off just cost us stuff. It made Spider-Man seem worse, made Gwen seem worse, and it made Norman seem worse. all it did was cost us as fans, and it offered us nothing. And yet, somehow, there is still one that tops it, and that is Number 1. Miss Marvel and her son. I am disturbed as some of you might be that incest seems to be a bit of a recurring theme on this list, but I didn't write this. In 1980, writer David Michelin and then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter were working on Avengers number 200. It was a big deal, a big landmark issue for the series, so they wanted a story that would be considered worthy of being such a big moment in Avengers history. And what did they go with? What is sealed in the pages of Avengers for all time? Oh boy. Well, this issue starts off with Miss Marvel mysteriously becoming pregnant and instantly giving birth. The baby grows up practically overnight and instantly falls in love with his mother. It turns out Carol was impregnated by this boy, named Marcus, who is like some weird trans-dimensional being, and now he's in love with her. He kidnaps Carol and using mind control devices, forces her to have sex with him, against her will. Now under the influence of Marcus, Carol agrees to go with him into this limbo rift separate dimension thing, where they will live out the rest of their lives together, away from Earth. And what did the Avengers think about all of this? Oh, they were totally fine with it. They never tried to stop her and sort of gave her blessing as she left. So this winds up being the weirdest, worst, and by far most messed up relationship out there in comic book history. And I think it's pretty self-evident why that is. What is perhaps most alarming is the way the comic book treats the whole thing. It makes it pretty clear this is a rape and a violation of Miss Marvel. I mean, there's no contest as far as that's concerned. Controlling somebody's mind and forcing them to have sex with you would be rape. Yet this comic treats it like it's almost romantic at times, as if there's nothing wrong with what's happening here. The Avengers are just totally down with this happening and don't say one word to the contrary. And yeah, tremendously disappointing to know that Jim Shooter had a hand in executing this story. The only apparently sane person working in the company at the time, Chris Claremont, wrote a comic a year later depicting Carol's return and very much acknowledging that the Avengers just sort of let her be kidnapped and raped by this alien entity. Taken in by the X-Men, Professor Xavier saved and protected her from Marcus's influence, thus ensuring this sort of thing could never happen again, only for the Avengers to show up, as if nothing had happened and wanting her back on the team. What Carol said next to them, I will repeat here because it is simply too good not to. I turned to you for help, and I got jokes. The Wasp thought it was great, and the Beast offered to play teddy bear. Your concerns were for the baby, not how it came to be, nor of the cost to me of that conception. You took everything Marcus said at face value. You didn't question, you didn't doubt. You simply let me go with a smile and a wave and a bouncy bon voyage. That was your mistake, for which I paid the price. My mistake was trusting you. After a trauma like mine, it is easy to wallow in bitterness and self-pity, but both grief and guilt have to be faced, dealt with, exercised. There's more, there has to be more, to being heroes than simply defeating villains. You have a role, a purpose, far greater than yourselves. You have to set examples, lead the way. You represent what we should be, what we dream of becoming, not what we are. You screwed up, Avengers. That's human. What is also human is the ability to learn from these mistakes, to grow, to mature. God damn, Chris Claremont, you know when the best X-Men writer chews you out for a story you've screwed up, and I think he nicely summarizes what's wrong with this relationship and what was so terrible about this story. But I also like how he leaves the Avengers, and by proxy the creators of this story, room to own up to their mistakes and do better in the future. That's a nice touch, shows a lot of class on the part of Chris Claremont, and Marvel did in fact learn from this. They vowed to never again let Carol Danvers do anything questionable or out of character. Oh, right. Never mind. So anyways, the disaster of the relationship has become notorious among fans, and I think it really represents the worst of the worst to me. But maybe it doesn't to you. Let me know which relationships you think are the worst in the comment section below. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you guys all had a great Valentine's Day, and if you didn't, well, just remember, it could always be worse. Much worse. And if you like this video, check out our Patreon page. You can help us make more videos and have a say in the content we make. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.